At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hello, Dr. Doug. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited. Interesting topic, and probably going to be an interesting number of topics that we're going to talk about today. I'd love for you to share with the audience who you are, because I know you have an incredible background on Wall Street, and suddenly now here you're doing your podcast, which my impression is it's entirely different than Wall Street. So maybe a little bit of it, but share with the audience who you are, what you've done in the past, and what brought you to this point where you're doing your podcast, which is Evolved Podcast, right?
Yeah, the Evolved Podcast is the name of the podcast. It's recently been changed. It was originally titled The Manhattan Prophet. I found people were sort of gravitating to it for looking for something kind of religious, which is really not what it is. If you listen to it, which I know you have. And I felt it needs to be rebranded a little bit just to fully encompass what the podcast is about. So kind of very quickly, I've been on Wall Street for about 2 decades. I've kind of, I started as a low-level analyst about 20 years ago, and I've kind of ascended to the point where I was able to co-found and manage as a managing partner my own hedge fund. So I've really kind of seen it all, been there, and it's really, I think, a combination of my innate desire from an early age to understand things, why things are the way they are in the world, why systems are set up the way they are, to the basic why people hold the belief systems that they do, right? And I kind of went on the path of Wall Street because I was always interested in how the corporations work. I remember watching on CNBC, kind of all the numbers go across the screen, the stock markets and things like that. I was interested in what the heck that was, and that that along with a desire to make money obviously drove me to the industry. And I think that the innate desire and curiosity, interest, and my experience has really given me a very interesting perspective, if you will, on a lot of the topics I discuss, and I think has cultivated a unique understanding, and something that I hope my listeners and this conversation with your listeners is impactful.
Well, and how did you come up with your podcast? And obviously the focus is, as you say, more on the people and so forth. How did you come up with the podcast idea and motivation for that?
Yeah, so look, again, my journey, I would say, in discovery and really in truth, was to get a proper construct understanding for the way society is structured, the way people decide or elect to do things. And it's taken me across a number of platitudes. It's taken me from looking into belief systems to economic systems to social systems to delving into ancient knowledge to modern day religious institutions. What you find is, and it's actually remarkable, is how the different topics or issues, if you will, transcend multiple planes. This is kind of a constant theme where anything from a metaphysical understanding to a self-identity understanding to social systems in our society, right? It's a very interestingly, surprisingly linear sort of relationship. And I think that as I, especially through my experience in Wall Street and seeing that end of things and seeing kind of, the society that I'm a part of, it really gave me a very interesting understanding. And my topics, I would say, are really rooted in providing people with a lot of knowledge, but most importantly, perspective. And letting people have the tools to look at these different topics in a unique way that they maybe wouldn't have or haven't before. And as I say, I think that it's really with giving people perspective, and hoping that sort of aha moment takes place and that resonates with them in some way. They can make a connection, and then they can maybe look into other topics like that. So yeah, I guess that's kind of high level.
Okay, and it's so interesting. Every once in a while I do a lot of social media stuff with my podcast, so I'm on there once in a while, and every once in a while I'll see something on, say, TikTok, and it's like, really? And so I'll do a little research on it, and it's absolutely not true. And
Yes.
yet the person who is speaking seems to really believe it. So when we start talking about perception and, quote, truth and reality, that gets to be a very, very confusing situation.
It really is, and it's important to taking a step back. We kind of live in, especially in the West, with dealing with this kind of fractured truth apparatus, right? Where we have institutions, government, the medical industry, healthcare industry, education systems that are really supposed to be at the bedrock of this kind of push for truth, to enlighten people, to help people, to provide people with the necessary information to make the right decisions in their lives, right? They're protect and serve. We want to create, good stewards of society, things of that nature. We want to make sure people's health is always at the forefront, right? But what's happened is you have a sort of these capitalist interests that come in and they taint the information that's being sent out, and it's for their own agendas, right? And this is really what a lot that I talk about, which is you have a society that has really and overtly, people don't realize this, but overtly been structured around a capitalist mindset, right? Where the end justifies the means, where capital is king, and this creates a pervasive decay on a societal level. And then what happens is when you have people, and this sort of makes sense, right? But I don't think people pick up on it necessarily. When you have those belief systems, when you have those values in society, when capitalism and your job and corporate interests create effectively the values, it impacts the individual's belief systems, and it impacts the individual's sense of self and identity, right? And this is really what I'm hammering home, and what I'm hoping to enlighten people to, where they might not necessarily understand why they believe the things that they do, or live their lives the way that they do. And what I have found, and again, it's important to be diligent in and having the right framework for discerning truth, because to your point, there's a lot of people out there who makes statements with such confidence, but when you look into it, it's readily apparent that it's just not the truth, right? But yeah. So yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What I was going to say is, I remember a saying that I got when I went back to business school, and truth is what truth is for you. And that's a belief, that's a saying. But from what I'm hearing you say, and quite frankly, what I believe is that truth to us is merely a result of our perception of what's going on. And what you're saying is, particularly this capitalistic concept is overpowering things to the point where we are kind of programmed to believe a certain way, to live a certain way, when in fact that's not really, quote, the truth.
Right, exactly. And I think that look, and I don't know how much time you spend between your respective places, which are very different from from a demographic and from a cultural standpoint, right? So, but especially in the West, you have let's just look over the last 100 years, right? You have this overt push through the Industrial Revolution with the robber barons and the industrialists who they formed overtly out in the open the education system in the United States. This is the system that we still use to this day. right? And what you find is that and they were outspoken, the underlying tenets of this system was not to create, I think they quote, philosophers or, men of letters and lawyers and doctors. It was to create docile workers who would lend themselves well to the industrialist framework, right? And the bureaucratic framework. This is what they were creating. And the curriculum, which was formed around the 18th century Prussian model, was in fact to do just that. So let's take a step back. Think about this. If you're growing up in America, you're going to school, everyone's going to school, everything, everybody's talking about the same fads and the this and the that, and you've got all these things going on with, you're a teenager. You don't ever kind of take a step back and say, wait a minute, why am I learning things the way that I am? Why am I sitting at a desk at the age of 8 for 6 hours a day, memorizing, learning, never questioning? You never question what you learn. You never question beliefs. You memorize beliefs. You memorize and regurgitate, right? You've been schooled across, you've been schooled for a while, so you understand how it works, right? You go and you memorize things and you regurgitate, and then you get an A or a B or a C, whatever the grade is. That's not how the real world works. The real world works is you go out there, you screw up, you fail, you figure out what you did wrong, you get back up and you do it again. Every successful person, myself included, the reason that they're successful is because of their perseverance and their desire to transcend whatever the setback is, right? You don't succeed. You don't become successful, quote unquote successful, unless you go through that push and pull, right? But the framework you get, and this is just one example, the framework you get from that indoctrination is vastly different from not only the real world, but from many other ways of viewing the world, right? So if you're corralled down this path, you're fed a very, and then you've got the society as a backdrop where it's very much a materialist, consumerist driven mindset. People don't see themselves as spiritual beings. They see themselves as material beings. The sciences teach you that, everything's material. This is not, we talk about truth and not truth, but this is not true, right? This is just not the truth. And we've discovered this, right, through quantum physics recently, where there's been a lot discovered recently in quantum physics, but where we learn everything is vibration and energy. Well, this is vastly different from what you're taught for 12 years in basic science, right? So but it's it's these little things that add up, and they shape and form your sense of self, and then again the way society views itself, and then that impacts how they live their lives and their behavior, right? They live their lives in many ways through repetition and appetite. They don't necessarily, or reflex and appetite and repetition. They don't necessarily take a step back again and see the big picture and what they are, and then come to understand the different ways that they might live their lives as a result.
Okay, so you talk about education. You went back quite a ways to the industrial age and so forth. I'm going to hit you with the education presently. What are your thoughts on what's going on there?
Remarkably, you've seen very little change, which I think is emblematic, and I think it speaks to a lot of what I'm saying, where you see these, and on a grander scale, if you look at the evolution of the human being relative to technological advancements across specific industries or market sectors, right? I mean, look at the amount of investment from infrastructure to R&D. Well, where are we now as human beings? Have we evolved? My contention is that we have not evolved. In fact, we may have devolved. Our health is the worst, physical and mental. We have bloated debt burden. I think we have the highest levels in the States. We have the highest levels of consumer credit card debt, I think, since 1999, by way of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I mean, so if you look across a number of different planes here, and you kind of have to, it kind of begs the question, what has been our focus? What have we decided to place our energy and attention to? And I think what you find is that it's through accumulating money, it's through working, and it's through consumption. This is not, in my opinion, the way that we should be structuring society. And if you go back and you look at the ancient teachings, and even the fundamental tenets of Abrahamic religions. This was not the way people wanted to live their lives and structure their lives, and this isn't necessarily the way that we should be, right?
Well, yeah.
So and what's interesting is, and you also see, and I speak to this. You see people who are, they're pessimists, and they're kind of overwhelmed, and they feel like we're in this matrix, and there's too much to overcome, there's too much corruption, and there's too much that's been infiltrated, and they're kind of like, they put their hands up and they say, it is what it is, like, I can't do anything. A lot of what I'm doing is I'm trying to make people reassess that belief, because that's just not the way they should be thinking. And I don't want to be dogmatic, but it doesn't lend itself to anything positive. And in truth, if you look at the systems, right, the systems themselves are not inherently evil. It's the consciousness beneath those systems. It's the people within those systems that have decided that this is how our education system should be structured. This is how our healthcare system should be structured. This is how our government should be structured. Now, so we in fact do have the power, right? We have the power to make changes. And people say, oh, well, there's so much corruption. Well, guess what? If people decide that they're not going to take the kickback, they're not going to take the bribe, right? This requires a paradigm shift in thought. And it's about coming to these realizations. And you come to these realizations by way of awakening people to, I believe, these facts. And I believe that
Yeah, let's talk about, this societal conditioning, because, you're talking about economics, you're talking about education, but there's a whole plethora of societal conditioning that goes on besides those. And as you've been doing your podcasts and interviewing people and so forth, what would you identify as the major societal conditioning items that are going on? And you mentioned religion, so that's obviously one of them. But what are some of the other ones that you see besides just the economics and the education?
I think that in the Western societal construct, I think that the main driver is money, and I think that has perverted and infiltrated everything from every sacred institution to people's identity and self-awareness. I think that, and it's not necessarily, again, this is important to state, it's not necessarily like people are just, greedy and they just want more and more and more. And people really, by virtue of the way things are set up, the systems, who benefits, who doesn't, people have to take on this mentality, because if they don't, they can't survive, right? In the West, you must plug into the system in order to live. You have to, not everybody has the fortune of being able to start a company that's hugely successful, or to go to medical school and pursue their dreams as a physician. The vast majority must take a low wage job whose wage is not necessarily determined by the right factors. We should be paying people more money. There should be a universal basic income. When we're spending $6 trillion a year on, F-all, I mean, just absolute garbage, right, around the world. We are taking, taxpayer dollars, and we are forcing Western hegemony down the world's throats, as we have been for decades. When we've elected to allow corporations to harvest and extract without any checks and balances, because, again, capital is king, and at least in this world. So we need to, and I believe that we need to start enlightening people, giving them complete information, and allowing them to make a decision about how they want to live their lives. If they're not given knowledge, or at least perspective, to your point, we don't make that leap, we don't make that jump. And I think that we are now, as you've seen, especially with what's been revealed by the recent administration, and I'm not trying to get political, I'm talking about facts here. The level of depravity and deception and decay that has taken place as a result is just, it's astounding. It's disgusting, and it really only kind of further legitimizes, I believe, what my effort is and many people's efforts are in giving people different perspectives and different ways of viewing themselves and the world around them.
Well, and as you talk about the economics, and that's the driving force, and I don't disagree with you. I think that has a lot to do with it. But for people's lives, there's so many other elements that go on. I mean, you have, as you mentioned, the word spirituality, and I want for you to define for the audience what you mean by spirituality, because you talked about the Abrahamic covenant and that type of thing. But people have lost, quote, their spirituality to such a large degree. And what is your definition of spirituality, number one? And then number two, why have we lost that in general in society? Now, people will say that's not true, but go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that is true. I think that that's a big component here, right? I think that when, I have always associated, by virtue of my own, indoctrination, I've always associated spirituality with religion, right? However, as you peel back the layers of the onion, if you will, what you find is it's in many ways the exact opposite of religion. And if you look back at ancient knowledge, if you go back to the Egyptians, right? Go back to even in many ways the Greeks, the Sumerians, there was an understanding, a scientific understanding that spirituality wasn't just about a mystical transcendence. It was part and parcel to our scientific understanding of the world. Now, maybe the way that they were expressing this relationship doesn't necessarily resonate with people's consciousness today, but spirituality again transcends planes where I believe that we are all spiritual beings living in a material realm, if you will. I believe that we are all part of a sort of universal consciousness getting to know itself through different faculties and experiences. We live in this realm, and it's about our connection to one another, recognizing this universal oneness, and it's about experiencing yourself on a higher plane, making that connection and saying, look, I'm not just this dust in the wind entity that goes around, dies, goes in the ground, and that was it. That was fun, right? This is not, in my opinion, right, in my belief, the way it is, and this is substantiated and legitimized through, again, ancient teachings, through really basic doctrine that you actually find when you go back into the old teachings, the original teachings of a lot of these Abrahamic faiths. You find that link, you find that connection, and this goes across Eastern philosophy. This goes into, again, the Abrahamic faiths. There are so many commonalities. There are so many common links. They are expressed differently because they're different cultures, but people don't realize that. People are so segmented. People are so disconnected, right? So again, I hope that answers the question. I can give you more there, but I think on a basic level, that's really what it's about. And it's about a personal connection to that realm, a personal connection to that field of experience. This is what real spirituality is. And just very quickly, but if you look at, one overt example, if you look at the Catholic Church, for example, right? And their origin, and even in the Jewish and Islamic faiths, you have this embedded patriarchy, right? Well, why do we have this embedded patriarchy? What was the reason? Well, the reason was there was a rejection of the feminine goddess, right? It was, and this was a function of societal, economic, sort of empire driving factors. But the sacred feminine was the mystical, spiritual part of consciousness, right? The male was the logical, rational, and there are many ways of expressing this. This was expressed differently across many different civilizations, but this was rejected, right? And this was because I believe, and this moved all the way into the Renaissance ages, the Enlightenment periods in Europe. I mean, the Pope reject anything other than a materialist worldview because you had to access the divine, the spiritual, the mystical through this
Yeah.
this institution, right?
And it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I didn't mean to interrupt there, but it's
No.
interesting as I've looked at it. For instance, today I was just looking at an article, and it was fascinating to me because what you say about losing the feminine part of it, and that Heavenly Mother, or however you want to refer to that, it was interesting because in many of the scriptures, particularly for Christianity, man is the head of the wife. Well, you get into the original meaning of that Greek, and what does it mean? He is the source. In other words, they're co-equal, but he is the source, apparently, but he's there to be co-equal with his wife and to support. And what I have found is that it's fascinating how the words that have been used, for instance, in English. And I was talking to some religious young men yesterday and talking about the fact that, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to sin? And they were going on, I said, well, what's the original Greek word? Or better, what? Perfection, be therefore perfect. What's the better word for that? And they go, oh, I don't know. I said, well, bottom line is, if you get to the original Greek, it's complete. Well, that changes the whole perception and truth of be complete rather than be perfect. And then what was interesting, and I said, so how does that equate into Thai? And because he speaks Thai, and he says, it's interesting. They don't have a word for perfect in Thai. He says it's more along the line of complete. So it's fascinating to me that when we look at modern day religion, in fact, what's really interesting to me is, we talk about spirituality, we talk about goodness, we talk about that innate divine within us. And yet all I see so much is Catholics this, Baptists that, Mormons that, Islam that, and so on and so forth. And it's like, here they are saying that they happen to belong to these various faiths and religions. And yet the very thing that is, as you say, taught from the foundation, going back, and you're right, I've studied it. You look at Christianity, you look at Islam, you look at Buddhism, you look at Hinduism, guess what? They all have basically the same truths that have been taught if you get to the root cause and root teachings. So it's interesting to me that somewhere along the line, people have lost this concept of honoring other people. I was fascinated when I'm here in Thailand. I went to one particular temple area, and as I was walking in, there was this other building on temple grounds, the Buddhist temple. And I'm going, what's that? And the guy said, oh, that's a Muslim temple. And I'm going, really? And what they've done is they incorporate and welcome everyone, all different religions. And you don't see that, that vehement kind of unkindness that exists. And, well, you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right, you're wrong, and type of thing. What has happened to us spiritually? Why has that happened, in your opinion?
Yeah, and I think that this requires a multifaceted answer, but I think what you're touching on, I think that it speaks to this sort of identity crisis that I call it, where you have people that are identifying through the systems that we've created, my country, my religion, my big house, my big paycheck, my job. But people don't realize that's not who they are. Right? Not even, and let's take this a level deeper. Their thoughts, their emotions, those are not you either, right? You are having your emotions and your thoughts. So when you have people, and again, this could be understood to be a part of this materialist understanding, where when you're looking to identify and find meaning even in the world around you and of yourself, well, what are you going to do? If you don't have the spiritual connection, you're going to gravitate towards the things that you do in the world, right? Again, you're misidentifying with these externalized ideas or systems, right? So I think that's a big part about it, where you have this fractured understanding. And people are in many ways unconscious of this, and they're also blinded by Oh, this guy has a different skin color. Oh, this guy speaks a different language. Oh, there's a different culture here. So people are almost, they think by virtue of what the individual looks like, again, a materialist understanding of the world, this guy's so different from me. This guy's is it. But guess what? They're not so different from you. We all have the same faculties. We all perceive things the same way, actively taste things the same way. We all and again, at the core of our belief systems, we all these were perverted, but we all believe in these same fundamental things. So it's important, again, in this effort to get people to think critically, to question, to develop a curiosity if they don't have one, and hopefully in doing so, they begin to look into, inherited belief systems, what I call to be things that are understood to be divine, but are just never checked, right? The way that one lives their life. Oh, it's just everyone else is doing. This is the way society is. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Why? Well, why are you supposed? What if it doesn't lend itself properly to you, right? And something that you can see right away, right? On a very basic level, if you look at students who don't, let's say, test well on the SAT or the MCAT or whatever standardized test it is, well, these people are not necessarily not intelligent, not smart. What it shows you is that the test itself is flawed. It's not accounting for the wide spectrum of intelligence. It's distilling certain abilities, logical, deductive abilities that will work well within the construct of our socioeconomic, infrastructure, if you will, that they will be able to excel in jobs that require these skills. But that right there, you are cutting people off right there and telling them that you're not smart enough, worthy enough, and that is why you are not getting the A or getting the great standardized test score, right? So it's really, and I believe again, if it keeps going back to this misunderstood sense of self, misunderstood identity, materialist driven by default way of viewing yourself and the world around you. And this is, I just did an episode on this, but if you look at globalism, right? If you really look at what globalism is telling people, it's that capitalism used to be a system where people were expressing the liberal ideal, liberal not being Democrat, Republican, liberal being really liberal is about individual self-interest being tantamount to everything else, right? So you had the liberal ideal as the driver, the liberal ideal as the driver, and that would bring the individual and society as a whole up. It was about the people living in a certain region, and if they follow along this way of conducting commerce and living amongst one another, that was the best way to do so. Well, what's happened now is that you have capital unchained, capital without any responsibility to a land, to a people, to anything sacred, anything divine, right? Now it's out there. It's dictating to governments what they can and cannot do. Now it's through the IMF and the World Bank and through intelligence agencies. I mean, this was the CIA over the past 100 years. They were effectively, high-end hitmen, high-end, body guys going around pushing corporate interest on South America, on Africa, and this was so that companies had an upper hand in that region, right? So it's really it transcends, and it's about understanding why certain structures aren't necessarily the right way to be doing things, and who those structures are benefiting.
Okay, so here's the question. We've talked a lot of generalities here, okay?
Yes.
So let's talk about the individual. I know that as you've worked with individuals, you've really helped to impact their lives. And I'd love for you to share, number one, how do you help them on an individual basis to deprogram from all of these societal interests and conditioning? And is there a story that you can share without naming names of where you've been able to actually help someone through that deprogramming really make a change in their life?
Yeah, so it's what's interesting is when you try to talk to people about these issues, what you find is that, and this is, I think this is just kind of basic human nature, but when you pierce somebody's veil and people kind of think to themselves, wait, has everything that I've thought to be true not true? Or, am I living my life in a way that I shouldn't be? Some people look at it as a constructive exercise. Other people are kind of can't take that. It's very scary for them to take that leap to the other side, right? But one story that I think is worth speaking to is actually with my own mother, and I really for years I've been speaking to her about how the corporations have infiltrated our food system in the States, and you have companies like Monsanto, for example, where they came out and they were using pesticides that killed the insects and the crops, and as a result they patented and sold their own GMO seeds, and those GMO seeds could now withstand the pesticide, specifically glyphosate, which is used. They call it, a might be carcinogen, but I think that the data speaks for itself. It also has terrible impact on the human, the endocrine system, the reproductive system, the microbiome in people's stomachs. So it's just a tragic situation, but people are not aware of this. So anyway, I really started pushing on my mother. I said, please stop eating non-organic produce. Please don't buy GMO products, because this glyphosate garbage is in everything, especially in the States. I think the numbers are crazy, like 90% or 90 to 100% of all corn and soybean product is GMO laden with glyphosate.
Wow.
This goes into snack foods, Pepperidge Farm, Goldfish, Cheerios. I mean, this isn't stuff we feed our children. The wheat is just pounded with stuff, and people don't associate or know. And I begged my mother, and I would send her articles, and I would send her. And this at the time was fringe. I mean, we saw a big expose recently, but this was very kind of fringe thinking. And I said to her, and she had a macrobiotic diet when she was younger, so I thought it would resonate with her. But it took me a long time to convince her to make that change. And I think that that's one way. So it's starting with giving people practical things that impact their daily lives, that aren't so woo-woo. Or if I go up to someone and say, listen, I know you think that you're just this material being that's going to die and nothing happens after life, right? I mean, it's tough to really get people to want to jump into that ship, right? So I kind of try to start with stuff that impacts them on a daily basis, and they're going to the health industry and how that shifted dramatically by the industrialists. The American Medical Association was set up. It was a BS association, Rockefeller and the Flexner Report of 1910. I mean, you go back and you really see what allopathic medicine does and did and why it was introduced. They were full rejection of holistic and homeopathic approaches to medicine, nutrition through medicine. I mean, or medicine through nutrition. I mean, that's the hack, right? If you eat well, your body is built to take care of itself on a fundamental level, right? Obviously, there are outliers there, but so this whole way of thinking, right? If you can again start small and start showing people, piece of information, allow them to make certain changes. I think that's the way to do it. And my mother, I was able to, after a couple of years, finally get her to start making these changes. And remarkably, and this is the truth, what she cites as changes in her life are insane. From increased clarity to from talking about the problems with alcohol consumption. I mean, just stopping drinking and not eating GMO products and ultra processed foods. So it's not necessarily all the information behind how the tobacco industry penetrated the food industry between the 1980s and 2000s with Kraft Nabisco. It's not necessarily going into those details with some people. Some people, that works well for them, but it's about getting people to make small changes that they can on a practical level in their lives, and hoping that, the bet pays off, that they'll start feeling it and experiencing it.
So how do you help people? Because when you get even deeper, and obviously you're talking about some things that are really tough to change, just like nutrition, no question about that. But as you think about even deeper aspects, you talk about religion and the effects that religion has had on people's mentality and self-worth, in many cases very positive, but in many cases very negative, particularly as I've interviewed so many people, and that seems to be one primary situation. Or you have childhood trauma, childhood experiences that get embedded in that subconscious mind. How do you even go there? Have you tried to help people to get to that point where they understand that, you know what, I'm not even living my own life. I'm living society's life. I'm living someone else's life. How do you help them to get to the point where, as you talk about spirituality, they really come back to the point that, hey, this is who I am and this is who I can be. And it's just a matter of starting to eliminate all of this junk that's been put on us.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because in many ways you have to kind of be sensitive to where you're looking to attack or approach. Because, for example, there are many ardent believers in Jesus, for example, right, in the word of Jesus. And there is such, first of all, I although I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, I believe that the teachings that you find, his teachings, right, are hugely beneficial and speak truth, right? So if you have somebody who maybe doesn't fully understand the truth behind this Jesus figure, but can appreciate the teachings, to me, it's like, pick your poison here, or choose your battles wisely, because I think that they're getting something beneficial from it. Now, if you have people who are, kind of like in a zombie-like state, believing that they're going to find salvation through going robotically to church or to temple or praying three times a day to Mecca, those people are not going to get to a touch on spirituality. They're like kind of like a greyhound on a racetrack. They're chasing this bunny. They don't know that. They think they're going to get there as long as they kiss the ring and go to mass, but they're never going to get there, right? They only get there if they allow themselves to understand the true history of their religion, and understand what true spirituality is. And just very quickly, and I'll kind of answer your question better. I know that wasn't necessarily what you're looking for, but people nowadays say, we're on a good trajectory. People are rejecting religion. They're gravitating towards spirituality. I have two things to say to that. One thing is, yes, but I call the popes like the wizards. I call them, they're like the Wizard of Oz. They cast their spell, and in doing so, the Christian faith, the United States of America is a Christian country. They are the bedrock of our civilization, cross continents. Their belief system, their way of viewing the world, their way of structuring is the underbelly of even political ideology, great thinkers, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. I mean, these guys were the bedrock of the Declaration of Independence in our Constitution. They were the great minds that structured, and they were Christians, right? So it's very difficult to separate that from today. So people don't understand that. They think that, they're rejecting the institution of the church, therefore things are on the right path. No, that's not what's going on, right? That's just not the reality. And I just lost my other train of thought here, but
That's
another.
all right. That's all right.
Yeah.
The point being, obviously, that values, if we get to the deep values, as you say, get back historically, the values are taught very similarly from all different religions. They just are.
That's a fact.
And yet, for some reason, we've tended to lose that. Now we're running out of time, my friend.
Yes. Sorry.
So a couple of questions. Number one, how do people find your podcast?
My podcast is across all platforms. So You can find it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart. It's called The Evolved Podcast with Aaron Scott. I would love for you to tune in and listen. I think that there's a lot of information I put out there that's perspective shifting, and I think that it'll be worth your time.
Okay. And if you could leave one final message with the audience, what would that be?
One final message would be to ask questions like why, how, create curiosity, and look for answers, look to improve yourself through that endeavor. That would be my message.
I love it. And curiosity is such an important thing, and it's fascinating to me. And we are going to close because we've run out of time. But the one thing that comes to my mind is as I've interviewed so many people, such as yourself and others, they've had this incredible life as far as professionally. And yet somewhere along the line, that curiosity has caused them to go beyond that economic aspect to where they're now looking at that spirituality. They're looking at that transformation. And so I appreciate what you're doing. And I hope that people come on your podcast because I think they'll get some great value. I've looked at some of them and I think that, the topics are just fantastic. So Aaron, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You bet. And folks, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is Dr. Doug saying namaste.